if you tag that one as predominantly inductive, because the inductive pattern of reasoning is typically where we go from what the author will call particular observations to more general conclusions. I tried echinacea 4 times, and it didn't get me any healthier. Therefore, it is likely that this was a piece of crap medical solution. Seems like an argument from strong induction. And by the way, reasoning it through it that way, I certainly can't fault you on it, because you did see that inductive thinking was being used. Now, the main reason why I'd said that it was also could be thought of deductively is because the arguer we are implicitly doing this when we're doing a scientific test. We say, if echinacea is effective as a cure, then it will make me better faster. But it didn't make me better faster. And that didn't make me better faster was we inductively tested it. We did something like, and I guess you'd call this in your science class, you did trials. You tried it out several times. You discovered several times that it didn't seem to work. And therefore you concluded, it's not the case that echinacea will help me to get better. It sounds like the Coldies commercials. You've watched TV, right? You've seen these. Oh, Coldies will make you get better faster. Of course, you all know what about nutritional supplements. These statements have not been tested by or are endorsed by the Food and Drug Administration. Yeah. Yeah. Basically, most of the claims they make are unverified, and if these things do make you any better, there's a good chance the old placebo effect might be at play. There's also a good chance that you are not a very good reporter of your own feeling better. Many times people will report that they feel better even if they're really not any better if they think they're supposed to be getting better. But anyway, I'll shut up about that for now. Now, ladies and gentlemen, you'll recall that looked at this way, we have a deductive pattern that you'll see again in Chapter 2. This is a valid form called what? And the reason I'm harping on this is because you're going to see this when? Yeah. Well, not necessarily on this quiz, but you'll be seeing this again and again. And it's one of the most basic valid deductive patterns that we have. And remember, if an argument is valid, it is such that it is constructed in such a way that if the premises are true, the conclusion will also necessarily be true. And if these premises are true, this conclusion will definitely be true. It's valid, it's modus tollens. And I would say in this case, it's probably not just valid, but also what? I would say that this argument is best evaluated as both valid and sound. Now, a sound argument is one that's valid and its premises are true. And if it's valid structure and its premises are true, then you can also trust that the conclusion is true. Just wanted to run through that again, real quickly. Now, why is this thing not sharing any love? Oh. Now, what I wanted to look at I don't always do this, but very frequently I like to type out my solutions to the homework problems. That is, if there is what I would call one better answer than others. I don't always do this, but I sometimes do this. Keeps me honest too, by the way. I don't just randomly assign homework and then not follow through. Now these are the ones that you did for the other day. I already got you feedback on them. I probably don't need to talk about this first one that I assigned to you. Anyone remember why I probably don't need to talk about it? That was one I assigned, but its solution is actually where also? Yeah, that's one of the ones where there's a rare solution in the back of the textbook. But I want to run through it anyway. Since everyone deserves health care and more than 40 million Americans don't have medical insurance, the United States should institute national health insurance. Now there's a premise indicator word there, and that was why this one shouldn't have been a tough one to figure out. The premise indicator word is, well, the word is since. We have since everyone deserves health care and 40 million people don't have insurance. So this is actually a two-part premise, and the conclusion was the United States should institute national insurance. Is there a clear-cut conclusion indicator word there? Should, yeah, should is the closest thing we have to a conclusion indicator word there, because they're making a claim about what we ought to do. And the other two provide reasons why we should do it. Now, I've noted here that, this one is indeed an argument. It's got premises and it's got a conclusion. At this point, we weren't asked to discuss whether or not the argument was cogent or not. And even though I like the conclusion, I still have, and my politics are showing, and I think it's probably not a bad thing to be honest about such things. I can tell you that I don't think this argument is cogent as it stands. Any takers? I actually agree with the first part of the premise. But a critic might say, Jack, that is a value judgment. This word deserves is something that is up for debate here. If you don't share my politics, you likely would say, no, everybody doesn't deserve health care. Because to say everybody deserves health care is basically to steal from other people in order to pay for their human right to health insurance. In other words, even if I happen to agree with that particular premise, to be intellectually fair, I have to admit what? It is not uncontroversially true, because it's a value judgment and not an empirical truth. If I were to support this argument, I would need an additional sub-argument to support my position that everybody deserves health care. Now, I also think that the more than 40 million Americans don't have medical insurance is also, that statement is controversially true. However, even if that's true, it still doesn't prove that the only solution to the problem is what? Nationalized health insurance. In other words, you would still have to coherently argue why national health insurance is the best solution. Hoover.
So if a premise includes someone's opinion, can you acknowledge that it's like valid and sound, but disagree? Like you think, I don't know, like, because if you disagree with it, then you're saying that it's, I guess it comes down to how you said people use valid incorrectly. Then, because if you're disagreeing, like, I'm sorry, I'm trying to find the words for this question. if you disagree with a premise, but like, can you still admit that it's valid or sound, like if it makes sense, but like ideologically agree with it?
I have an answer for you.
Is that-
The argument would still be valid, but if one of the premises is not uncontroversially true, you can't definitively say that the argument is sound. To further argue, you would actually have to add to that discussion in such a way to support that controversial premise. So guess what you're technically going to need if you want to defend this argument? Another argument.
So that's what a debate
Yeah.
is, basically.
Yeah.
Okay.
This basically is indeed an argument, but it's really only a starting point.
So if you disagree with a valid premise, then it's just not sound?
If you disagree with a premise, because remember, premises are not valid or invalid, arguments are valid or
Okay,
invalid. Yeah. If a premise is a value judgment, it is best for you to acknowledge that you agree with the value judgment, but to understand that calling it true is certainly up for grabs.
Okay.
Because that claim, everyone deserves health care, well, that's something people disagree on. And granted, I don't know that I could, I'll put the word on the board. It's a very well-known word, but I just want to highlight proof. Proof is a very difficult standard to uphold. I mean, to defend the claim everybody deserves health insurance, Hoover was getting at this, it turns into a very difficult ideological debate. An ideological debate that Americans do not agree on. An ideological debate, as a matter of fact, people are willing to beat each other up over this. And there's certainly a lot of yelling at one another on talk radio and political talk TV. But yeah, that premise, even though I would say I generally agree with it, I know I can't prove it in a way that would satisfy my wife's stepdad. Good. How was that? Pretty fair? Yeah. Good. Looking for this thing. Second one. Yeah, this one was one that we did. I have my doubts about genetically modified plants. To begin with, we don't have enough information about them to know if they are bad for us in the long run. Then there is the problem of cross-contamination if they spread to other areas. The whole thing seems questionable. Folks, I would call this one an argument, but I would argue that it is slipshod put together. You might want to restate this person's conclusion in a more coherent way. The person's basically saying that we probably should not move forward with genetically modified plants. That's how I would say it. Reasons? Well, because we don't know about their long-term effects, and there is evidence that there have already been problems with cross-contamination. So this one I would say is an argument because it's got a conclusion, even though it's kind of not all that articulate. And there are supporting reasons. Now, of course, this is really just the start of an argument, too. Is that pretty clear? Now, this one I did not assign, but we may as well look at it since I have a sample solution. This is a famous argument from Aristotle. The Earth has a spherical shape, for the night sky looks different in the northern and southern parts of the Earth. And that would be the case if the Earth were spherical in shape. Is this an argument?
Yeah.
Yes, indeed it's an argument. We don't have a conclusion indicator word, but we do have a what? We have a premise indicator word. Oh, I say it right there, I forgot. Yeah, for is a premise indicator word. Now there's no conclusion indicator word, but he starts out with his conclusion. He goes, the earth has a spherical shape. Why? Well, the night sky looks different in the northern and southern parts of the earth. And that would be the case if the earth were spherical in shape. Can that conclusion definitively be drawn? My answer would be no. Even though Aristotle turns out to be what? Turns out to be correct, because there are other forms where that observation would also be consistent with. Reasonable argument, but I would argue also not foolproof, and this is partly because there are other shapes that would also be consistent. I don't want to go all crazy on you people here, but there was one ancient Greek philosopher that came before Aristotle. Remember, these guys didn't have telescopes or anything like this. He hypothesized that the earth was cylindrical in shape. And it would turn out that the night sky would, in fact, look different from one side than the other if it were spherical in shape, too. You know, sort of like a giant cigarette butt floating in space. I guess you're not allowed to talk about it. You're not allowed to mention ciggies anymore. Anyway, it's not an endorsement to mention it, so don't. Anyway.
Like you as a teacher, you're not allowed to talk about it?
Oh, I don't know what I'm allowed to talk about. You know, you're supposed to be careful. Yeah, you got to be careful, because even mentioning something might be misconstrued as an endorsement. Anyway. I'm kind of joking around about that because we're all intelligent enough and mature enough to tell the difference, I think, between an offhand remark and an endorsement. But anyway, folks, this is what I did assign. Let's run through it. This one is an argument, even though it wasn't all that well, yeah, I even said it here. So while it isn't all that well organized, I reconstructed it. Let's read it. College costs big bucks. When you put out that kind of money, you should be able to decide where your money goes. Students shouldn't have to take introductory courses if they don't want to. Besides, you don't need those basic courses for a lot of careers. Now, one of the main reasons I said not too well organized is because the conclusion is not where one would expect it to be in a well-organized argument. Where would you expect it to be if it were well-organized? Yeah, beginning or the end. And this is slipshod, smacked in the middle of the piece. The conclusion is actually students shouldn't have to take introductory courses if they don't want to. Well, why? College costs a lot of money, and when you put out that kind of money, you should have some kind of say in where that money goes. Now, this word besides is a what? Besides is a little bit like what other word? And also. Besides, you don't need those basic courses for a lot of careers. So even though besides is not on a typical list of premise indicator words, guess what? It turns out here to be like a premise indicator word. Is this a strong argument? I didn't ask that question. No, it's a pretty damn poor argument. Hoover.
Would they be considered, like, I understand like how they might be relative to each other, but I still feel like they're two separate like claims basically, so would they be two different arguments?
Well,
because like one has to do with like the money, and then one has to do with like courses, which I get how they're related, but like I feel like the way they set up like two separate claims.
Well, this is the conclusion right here. And there are actually two premises. The two premises are actually unrelated to one another. The first, I should say, set of premises is the first of the premises restated is you should get to decide, especially when you pay that much money. Now, what value judgment that most of us are taught to accept would seem to support this idea as true, at least in a general sense? Yeah.
The customer is always right.
Yeah, in the economic marketplace, if you are buying something, you should, you should have some kind of freedom in deciding what you're buying. And when you buy something, you shouldn't be forced into things. Now, of course, the question here is, when you buy an education, are you necessarily getting exactly what you want? The answer is no. It is sort of an agreement that if you are going to undertake a certain course of study, that there will be what? Yeah, there will be requirements. I do not want someone to get a nursing degree here who cannot do basic math. I don't want someone to screw up the dosage. If my dad's, he had a heart attack a year and a half ago, and granted he was heavily reliant on medical people around him knowing what the Hades they were doing. The fact is, there are basic requirements covered in what I'm going more further than I want to. I'm actually attacking both of these premises simultaneously. The other premises, you don't need those basic courses anyway. I call bullcrap, if I'm allowed to use that word. I call bullcrap on that premise. I would argue that those basic courses are the ones that you actually need in order to prepare you for the other classes. And granted, you might not need them in a direct way, but you certainly need them in at least an indirect way. Because if you cannot read and write or have basic math skills, you won't be able to get to the next level. Yeah, you won't be able to get to the next step. So yeah, I have a total beef with this claim, you don't need those basic courses anyway. The fact is, the basic courses are sometimes the most important building blocks to prepare you for those other things. Now granted, I don't want to go off on too much of a critical tangent here, but I've heard people say, why the heck, if I'm going to become a healthcare professional, why do I really need to take something like chemistry? Because all I'm really going to be doing is going through a particular set of rote procedures. I'd say, well, you probably don't entirely know what you're going to be doing. Because the fact is, no matter what occupation you are doing, you will probably need to do a little bit of critical thinking. And if you don't understand the basic science behind biology and chemistry, you might be what people call SOL when it comes to doing the kind of critical thinking that you may need to do at some point. Now the hope is that you won't have to do a lot of that critical thinking, because hopefully most things will be fairly routine. But guess what? I'm sorry folks, things are not always routine. And you ought to have those kind of skills. Anyway, I kind of talked about all we did right here. But yeah, this is certainly an argument. But there's certainly definite problems. I won't call this a false premise per se, but I will call this a questionable premise. Because I would say in certain sectors of the economy, the buyer should have a choice and get what she pays for. But education is not like buying a toaster. Does that make pretty good sense? Education is not like buying a television. In other words, the people in the know what you need. And what you need might not be what you want. And you don't need those basic courses anyway. I hope I thoroughly beat up that premise. You know why that one is false. Is that pretty good? Now, did anyone want to look at any of the other ones from the other day? Did I not bring my notes down from those? Oh, bother. Anyone want to look at any of the ones from this other problem set that we did? I just asked you to look at a couple of these. This is the beauty of having one of these cans here. As I remember, we did 2 and 3, am I right? Or is it 2 and 5? Yeah,
It was 2, 5, and 9.
2 and 5.
2, 5, and 12.
Yeah, good, yeah. And the funny thing is, when I planned to assign that one, the Patriots had not made the Super Bowl again yet. You know, the Patriots one that I assigned, but I guess they're in every year, so what am I talking about? That kind of sarcasm. Anyway, 2, we are never going to find a cure for diabetes, cancer, Alzheimer's, and a lot of other diseases unless we use the most promising research available. That's obviously not a conclusion. That's the what? That's the premise. Therefore, stem cell research is the way to go. Folks, I would call this, I would say this is an argument. However, it's certainly incomplete. We've got a conclusion here, and we've got a premise here. Now, this is a place where that word implied premise may have come in handy. Because the implied premise here that's unstated is that stem cell research is the most promising. That's the unstated implied premise there. Now, of course, more work would be needed to be done in order to explain why it's the most promising. But this is definitely an argument with a conclusion, a premise, and an implied premise. Was that pretty good? Pretty fair? Good.